look at user interfaces, then next we're going to look at data and privacy. Right, so that privacy, of course, as you know, is a big issue, right? But why is it such a big issue? We'll look at different aspects. Then we'll also look at what kind of technology solutions already exist, right? So things like differential privacy, k-anonymity, blind signatures, and private communication using tools like Tor and several other things, right? So we'll see that a lot of that already exists, right? But not many implementations are using such tools. And why is that? So that again brings us into the broader politics with which we need to also examine technology. Yeah. So those sorts of angles are quite relevant. Then after that, we'll get into algorithms, right? And algorithms and artificial intelligence, as we know, right? We've seen several examples of these things. So we'll look at different reasons why algorithmic objectives become important to code, and how sometimes, especially with data-driven algorithms in AI and machine learning, these things can get violated, right? Then after that, we look at that, okay, these are sort of things inside a technology system that we're building. But once the technology system starts interfacing with society, right? So what's called the socio-technical interface, many issues arise at that point, right? Because these are unanticipated ways in which people use the technology, and some people might use it for gains, self-interest. So how do we guard against that, right? And that will expose us that we not only need to work on things like user interface and privacy enhancing technologies and algorithms and everything within the technology, but we also need to go beyond the technology to look at the management aspects of the technology. Yeah. So we look at the socio-technical interface, and as part of this, we'll also look at the broader system design. So when you introduce a technology, yeah, now the technology has several users to it, different types of users, right? Like in Amazon kind of a marketplace, there are producers and there are consumers. In Uber, there are drivers and there are customers, right? And so similarly in Facebook, there are users, there are advertisers. Even among users, there are different kinds of users. Some are power users, owners of communities, very highly connected. Some are not. Right. So when we introduce a technology system, it actually, the way I look at it, in fact, and which so write about in my book, is how the technology changes power relationships between these different users, between the different stakeholders of the technology. Yeah. So that is another area where it becomes very important to think through that, okay, you've designed the technology very nicely with user interfaces and good privacy and algorithms, and you're connected with how users are going to use the technology, and you're trying to manage it all very well, right? But management towards what objective, right? That becomes very important, and that will be the fifth component of examining technology, from how it changes these power dynamics between people, right? So now for the next several weeks, we're going to look at each of these things one by one. Yeah. And then after that, we'll then again try to look at everything we've done in perspective and bring out some elements, right? That now that there are so many of these issues, how do we start tackling them, right? So there's things about technologists themselves being responsible, about using design methods, about the broader organizational culture and values in which we work, and the political economy. So we will cover that after we've looked at all these technology-based solutions. So that will essentially round it up, right? That there are all these issues, there are certain solutions, and then, right, how do we make sure that some of these solutions are actually implemented? So to what extent can we be responsible ourselves? To what extent can we hold our organizations accountable to do this? To what extent it's shaped by the broader political economy, and can we also influence that, right? So that will be the overall structure, right, that we'll look at. So then let me begin sharing. So we're going to start with user interfaces. Yeah. So you can see all this, right? So the screen is visible? And
yes.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So this is roughly how, and I think we'll probably be able to cover all of it today itself. It's not very complicated. So the way to think about this is right. So on the one hand, we will look at what happens when people use technology for their own self-interest, right? And how they try to persuade other people, right? So that we look at later. We're concerned here with technology, which is where the technology design itself might be designed to persuade us to take certain actions, right? So how the user interfaces can influence what we click, options we select, how these user interfaces can shape our norms, and how people attach a personality to computers, to technology, right? So these sorts of things are important to keep in mind when we're building these tools. And then, of course, right, so it's all about exploiting biases, right? And why do such biases arise among humans, right? So that's the other part that we'll look at. Yeah. So there's this website that you should go to, Dark Patterns, right? So here they're trying to document various kinds of which clearly seem to be manipulative patterns in the user interface design, right? Like over here, there's a form and the default is opt-in, right? So if you want to opt out, then you have to read it carefully and select that please do not send me details of products and offers from so and so, right? And in fact, now it has been outlawed that it is that you cannot have opt-in as the default, right? But you should have default should be opt out. So the reason why these are called dark patterns is because a user who's not like looking at it very carefully, right? Somebody, right? We're all getting more and more busy, and we just fill out the form and just go on to submit the form, right? And it ends up subscribing us, and then we get all the spam and everything, right? So there's a whole bunch of such dark patterns that we see on websites, and I'm sure all of you would have seen some of this, right? Here there is this bundling which makes comparisons hard, right? So in one case it's in terms of right number of apples, for example. In another case it's in terms of the weight, and then the units can also be different in terms of how it's presented, right? So now if somebody is trying to find out what's the best value for money that they can get, it becomes difficult, right? And right, so the point is that some of it has been intentionally designed to be like that, right? So that's why it's called a dark pattern, right? And you can also think deeper now that which ethical theories would support or reject such patterns, right? So right, so here you're essentially curtailing, making it difficult for the user to understand, to freely choose. So you're really impacting things like the autonomy of the user, the rationality of the user, right? So you can see that it connects with various principles that we've seen, right, with Kant and Rawls and everything, in terms of what principles are they advocating that we should try to follow, right? So these may seem like trivial examples, but it's the same underlying rules and reasons which we can consider, right? That should something like this be supported or rejected? Yeah. Right, so here's more, right? I'm sure this happens with us all the time, right? Things like delivery cost and other things show up right at the end, right? So again, many of these things are now being regulated so that orders are not placed automatically. There's an additional confirmation step beyond that. But you can roll back 5-6 years earlier where many of these things were actually not that well regulated. Okay. Now you can actually go to consumer court to take up some of these issues. So in fact, it happened with me once also on Clear Trip, where there was some, right, couple of years back, there were some of these, right, they just automatically signed me up for some travel insurance. And then I actually complained in the consumer forum, the government, which the government runs, right? So the government, you would know, right, has a consumer rights department. And then I didn't get my money back, but at least this process does work, that it went up to Clear Trip, and then some official from Clear Trip actually responded. But yeah, I mean, these sorts of things can happen. Yeah. Similarly, right, there's this upgrade, and the only options are upgrade now and okay, right? So there's nothing for canceling the upgrade. Things like how you present information, which ends up guilting users, right? That like they're missing out on something. Yeah. So there's many such things, right? Similarly, disguise ads, right? Which we all see quite regularly. That there's these download buttons and so on which show up. LinkedIn was also fined once for making it so essentially misrepresenting, right? So LinkedIn was of course trying to grow their network, and this was one way in which they said that these people, it appeared that these people are already on LinkedIn and you want to just connect to them, but actually this was an invitation going to them to join LinkedIn, and then they could connect with you, right? So these things were brought up, and fines were actually imposed. Similarly, actually, even with WhatsApp, right? So I don't use WhatsApp, and this is many years back. That one of the main reasons why I didn't get on WhatsApp was because anybody could add me to any group without even asking me, and I just felt that to be very wrong. And later on, of course, we saw, I mean, all sorts of other issues. One of my main reasons for not getting onto WhatsApp was because of the way the user interface itself was designed, which was essentially, right, it was like a free for all, right? Anybody could add you to anything without asking you. You if you have to, you could log out, right? You could remove yourself from the group, but then that's an additional action. And plus, right, it gets into this whole psychological thing that you then, if you move out, then everybody else is also informed that you've left the group, right? So it gets into that whole dynamic. But just opt in by letting you join without permission, right? That is not appropriate. Right, then we've seen this Uber example earlier of how it uses this kind of gamification and what are known as ludic loops, right? That invite the drivers, right? Persuade them to stay on the roads for longer and longer, right? So the point is that the way these user interfaces are designed, they are essentially nudging you to take certain actions, right? They're making certain actions easier to take, or what you're more likely to take, and this can be done with a manipulative intention. Yeah. So that is what becomes quite important to think about, right? So the point is that why does this happen in the first place? Yeah. Now, this is something which is now studied extensively in what's known as behavioral economics, right? So, behavioral economics is actually the study itself of predictable biases, that we are biased to act in certain ways. Can some of these biases be exploited for useful purposes, right? So that's what behavioral economics says, that, and we look at certain examples like persuading people to opt for good retirement plans, or you may have heard these things about smart electricity meters, that that these smart meters were put up in people's homes, and you could not only monitor your own electricity consumption, but it also gave you a smiley or a sad face based on whether your electricity consumption was lower or higher than that of your neighbors. Yeah. So this is what behavioral economics basically says, is that these kind of nudges should be used to persuade users to opt for certain actions which are useful for them, which are meant for their welfare. Yeah. But the same thing can also be, right, the same science can also be used in the reverse way, and which is often what happens in marketing, right? That many of these patterns that we saw, right, they have a scientific basis behind them, right? So here's an example, right? These are experiments that were done, right? So there's something called the decoy effect, that in one case these two options are presented, that there's an ebook that you can buy, and there's an ebook and a hardcover book that you can buy, and in this case 69% people chose this, and so on. But then a decoy option was added, where the hardcover is for $20 and the ebook and hardcover both are also for $20, right? And in this case, the response is completely flipped, right? So now suddenly people felt that, well, let's just buy this ebook and hardcover. So they ended up spending $20 to buy the ebook and the hardcover, just because this decoy option was introduced in the choice menu of choices, right? Similarly, there's another well-known effect called the scarcity effect, that here now there are two options, right? In one experiment, you're shown this option along with this scarcity signal that only 5 are left, and people tend to choose this. Now over here everything is the same, only the scarcity shifted to the other more expensive option. Suddenly people start choosing this option. Yeah. So why does this happen, right? So now behavioral economics says that basically humans, we are loss averse. We value loss more than gain. Yeah. So if we had options of getting 100 rupees versus losing 10 rupees, yeah, then we end up valuing the losing 10 rupees part more than valuing the gaining of 100 rupees, right? So this is called loss aversion. So what behavioral economics and all of this is really doing is measuring it, right? Measuring it and making it predictable. That what kind of, right, should this right, what kind of a decoy effect should be introduced? Should it be $20? Should it be $15? Right? Similarly, over here, should you say only 5 left? Should you say only 20 left? Right? So these, therefore, the way we present these options, they make us behave in certain, they make humans behave in certain predictable ways. And that's what is actually measurable, and companies can actually run A/B experiments to do that. So I'm sure you must have heard this thing called A/B experiments, where, right, so if a company wants to experiment with what works better, only 5 left or only 10 left or only 15 left, right? Which one makes people behave in something that the company wants them to do, right? So then they would present one section of users with only 5 left, another section of users with only 10 left, one with only 15 left, and then they would look at the conversions, right? So it's pretty much like conducting randomized control trials, right? And companies can do this at scale, right? Now, like a company like Facebook or a company like Google or a company like Amazon can very easily experiment with this without us actually even getting to know about it. Yeah, that, and in fact that is what happens all the time, right? So all the time there are actually experiments happening. We are participating in these experiments. We don't know about it. And later on in the course, we'll also study some of the ethics of this, right? That if, for example, we are to participate in a research study, then there are review boards that the study has to go through the review board approval, and the review board makes sure that there'll be a part, they'll be in the study, consent has to be sought from them and everything, right? But companies, of course, do these experiments all the time, and it's projected more as not really research, but more of quality improvement. And this is permitted under law, right? That if you're running a service and you want to do some experiments for quality improvement, that's permitted. It's not counted as research. But actually, I mean, this research is happening all the time inside companies. So there are ethical issues, of course, with it. But coming back, right? The point is that we tend to behave in certain ways, and it is measurable, right? And therefore, it can be used to manipulate us. Yeah. So now again, you can go back to all the various theories that we've seen, right? Because this is ultimately impacting our freedom, right? It is impacting, right? It is making us do certain things which we may not have done otherwise, right? So that's one of the things why how this misuse happens, right? So this loss aversion, right? And there's many such effects. So this middle option effect, that if, right, there's a lower option, there's a higher option, people end up choosing the middle one if they can't really make out much of a difference. And when this is changed, again the middle one is dominant. When this is made a bit higher, right, then the effect diminishes, but still the middle option is being evaluated, right? So if you want people to buy things at a particular price, right, you can actually get people to agree to a price by actually putting up some options less than that, some options more than that, right? So this is called the middle option effect. And similarly, there's an anchor effect to sort in decreasing order of price. When you're looking at a menu, right, and normally you would scan the menu from top to bottom, right? And if the first item that you see, that typically now people have seen that becomes your anchor, and then you end up evaluating everything else in terms of this first item. So the first item that somebody wants to put up on a menu can therefore become another source of influencing how you perceive the other options, and therefore which one would you choose, right? So the term for this is called choice architecture, right? So that's the choice architecture is what the term that the behavioral economists have come up with, right? To convey the point that the way you present these choices, right? There are anchor effects, middle option effects, decoy options, and so on, right? And which can influence the choices that are actually made, right? So similarly, there's a status quo bias, right? That normally whatever is the default, if you're not able to evaluate much, we'll just go with the default. Yeah, so this becomes important. Primacy and recency effects, recall only the first and the last options, right? So this is just a cognitive limitation that if there's a whole bunch of options presented, normally we would remember the first one and the last one, and just based on that, we would try and make a choice. So how it's laid out, it becomes important. And similarly, norm bias, which we'll look at soon enough, right? In being influenced by the behavior of others. So this is like the smart electricity meter example I gave, right? That it can, right, the way you present information about what other people are doing, yeah, that so many people bought this item and so many people bought this other item, right? Those also influence what you would end up doing. So that's the idea, right, that these user interfaces can be, there's like cartoons done on this, right? So he's saying donuts are way over there, so I should have fruit. And right, so this guy is saying my cunning choice architecture will soon have Homer eating healthy. Yeah. So right, so there's all of this. Yeah. So behavioral economics, of course, the way behavioral economics is pitching these kinds of tools is that as long as it improves people's welfare, right, you want to nudge them to take to choosing good options, right? Now you would say that this is unethical, right, because you're actually not valuing the volition of the users, right? You're actually influencing the choices they're making, you're influencing their freedom, their liberty, right? Rather, you should be educating them that which option is better for you and so on, right? So there are different ways to think about it, right? The other way is, of course, to make it coercive, that you're just being forced that okay, this option is good for you, so just do this. Yeah, right. So there's no right answer, right? It depends on the society that we're living with. Now, typically, this is where behavioral economics is used very extensively for adoption of in government policies to drive adoption, like of different things, like used in retirement plans, where people tend to not choose good retirement plans for themselves. Now, this is something that behavioral economics has observed, that people tend to see their older selves as strangers, right? That we don't see our older selves as just what we would be, right? But rather that okay, this is some person, and let's think about how that person can be helped the most. And that is one reason why we don't always choose the best options. So here, if the government wants us to choose some good retirement plans, then they can present options in such a way that makes us choose better ones for us, right? Similarly, like organ donation. So here, opt-in was the default in Austria, and 90% people opted in. In the US, opt-out is the default, and only 15% people opted in, right? So the government can nudge people to take certain things, right? So default effect happens to due to human laziness, or the fact that people may perceive the default as the authoritative recommendation, right? That okay, default is actually what is probably also recommended. So these are essentially biases that are built into it, and you can say that, well, if the design were transparent and not misleading, easy to opt out of, and driven by the strong belief that the behavior being encouraged will improve the welfare of those being nudged, right? Then you can say that, well, these kinds of use of these nudges is good, right? And it is not coercive. It is not, you're still getting people to do the right thing, choose things which are better for them, but without actually forcing them, without coercion, right? So it's called liberal paternalism, that you're being paternalistic like a parent, but you're also giving people the liberty to choose what they want. Yeah. So right. So this is sort of the good side to understanding human biases and being able to leverage them to persuade users to do something which is going to be useful for them. But like all the other examples we saw of dark patterns, that the same biases are also exploited. Yeah, they can also be exploited to make people do something which is not useful for them. Yeah. So there's other techniques also. So nudging is one, and there's other things like introducing the friction. Friction meaning making some options harder to choose. Yeah. Right. So an example given. So behavioral economics and right. So this nudge theory. This is actually, it's also been awarded the Nobel Prize. Right. So Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein are the two economists who actually got the Nobel Prize in economics recently, couple of years back, for doing this. And their book is called, they wrote a book for public, which is very accessible, right, for public science and public, called Nudge. And these are also some examples that they provide, right, of how, right, so these are sort of good nudges, but how the nudges can also be used for bad things. And or other things like introducing friction can lead to users making poor choices, right? So one example that they also quote is in South Africa, where it's very easy for people to get loans, right? So essentially from ATMs, people are able to get pre-approved loans of up to a certain amount, right? Now that becomes, if it's very easy to get a loan, now a loan always comes with certain riders, right? There are payback things, there are hefty late fees which are charged if you default. and therefore there needs to be, you should be made to think, right, that you really need the loan or not, right? So rather than making it easy for you to get loans, it should actually be the other way, right? That loans should be made more accessible, but that doesn't mean, it's not the same thing as saying that it's easy to get a loan, right? It should be made accessible so everybody has an option to take a loan, but there should be sufficient safeguards and controls put into the picture to make sure that if you take a loan and so you don't get into trouble, you're not in a situation that it becomes very difficult for you to repay the loan, because then it leads to all this extortion that we hear about a lot. And even during the COVID pandemic last year, must have seen the news, right? There are all these instant loan applications now where, right, you just have to upload some ID details, and which also is now easier to do with Aadhaar, right? So you can and then it becomes very easy for you to get a loan. But there were all these cases that came up of harassment, that because people needed money, they took a loan, but people have lost jobs and it's not easy for them to repay. And then there are all these harassment tactics being used by these loan apps, like emailing all the contacts of the person to put more social pressure, right? So there's emails going to the contact that so-and-so person has not been able to repay their loan. And it's also led to a lot of suicides. And similar things have also been reported with microfinance, right? So not sure how many of you would understand about microfinance, but right, so this also has won the Nobel Prize. Muhammad Yunus won the Nobel Prize for microfinance, and the idea is that you give small loans to people and they would repay them, where they would need these loans for like health emergencies or maybe to start a small business. And they typically repay the loans because of the social pressure, that the loan is not given just to that person, but actually there's a group called a joint liability group. So the liability is jointly divided among the members. So they're all sort of responsible to make sure that the loan gets repaid. And right, so while it's also been very useful, but just giving out these loans very easily, and where when people have not thought enough that is it going to be easy for us to repay these loans or not, then it's also led to suicide, because there's a lot of peer pressure that gets created through the joint liability groups. Because if you don't repay the loan, the entire group gets impacted, and then other people in the group are also not able to take loans because that group has sort of been blacklisted, and therefore they put pressure on the rest of the group members to repay. And this is one of the reasons why some years back the government also came down very heavily on the microfinance industry in India, and there are now much tighter regulations in place to give microfinance loans, and things like you can't take up loans from multiple agencies. So there's some level of regulation that has been brought in. Yeah. But again, right, coming back to the topic, right, that this is one of the reasons why user interfaces therefore become important to think through, because they can influence what options are easier to choose, harder to choose. They can be used to persuade people to choose certain options, right? And all of that therefore needs a lot of forethought. Yeah. And then, yeah, so there's of course right now scientific technical ways to design these nudges, right? So this is what behavioral economics, marketing, the fields have actually experimented. They've designed methods to do this, but right, it comes with a lot of responsibility, and needs that kind of a thoughtfulness. Yeah, right. So this was one part, right, of how user interfaces can persuade individual choices, right? The second is, so it's a very interesting paper, right, on metricization on Facebook, right? So we'll come back, right? So the point is that this is what a Facebook page, I mean, until some time back, now they've changed it, but again, the content is the same. So think about all the metrics that are there, right? So many people like this, so many people share this, so many comments, right? So many messages, events, this, that, right? So these are all, right? So many mutual friends and so on. So these are all like numbers, right? And the page is literally full of metrics and numbers which have been given to us. Yeah. So, and the question is that, is this influencing us in any way? Is this making us do something that had these numbers not been there, we may not have done? Yeah. So what do you think, right? What do you think it could be happening? Anybody?
So there could be multiple things. For example, if we see down there in the where we can see the names. If I didn't see one there, I wouldn't click on it because I see the number there. I know that there is a message, so I would want to click and open it.
Mm-hmm.
Then on the right side, when we're seeing suggestions for people, maybe a high number of mutual friends suggest that, oh, I might want to check this person out because I might know them. And had that number not been there, I might have just ignored that as a random name. Then notification buttons are pretty easy because had they not been lit up, I wouldn't have clicked on them. Those are some examples I can think of.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So then let's think about it, right? So what if these were not numbers? Maybe just some indicator, right? I mean, just an indicator that you have new messages, or just an indicator that you have some mutual friends. Right? Would that change? How are the numbers sort of influencing us? I mean, so that's what this paper is about, actually, right? So the point of the paper is that these numbers are actually quantifying social performance in some sense, right? So the title is How Quantification Prescribes Social Interaction, right? So this is how the argument that they use, right? That psychology has shown that self-worth is an essential human need, and you must have heard about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Things like psychological needs like food, water are very important. Once most of these are satisfied, right? Not necessarily, right? Then people want more safety, security. Once these are to some extent satisfied, then there's belongingness, relationships, and there's esteem, right? That what you get, how you're acknowledged by the rest of the society. And then there's self-actualization, that whatever you want to do, are you able to do that, right? And so this is designed as a hierarchy that there's some basic needs, and once they are more or less met, then we move to higher needs. And right, order of the needs is not rigid, but can be, right, different things might be more important in different cultures, different societies. And most behavior is multi-motivated, so many things would be acting together, right? But essentially the point over here is that we do value. So these are some things that Maslow identified, and then psychology, as you would know, right? The field of psychology then also tries to measure all of this, right? It tries to measure whether what are these traits, to what extent are they impactful, and so they design all these different kinds of experiments to see how people respond, right? But the point is that esteem becomes important, right? That how we see ourselves, right? Need for self-respect, need for how others perceive us, right? And essentially Facebook metrics like number of friends or the likes that our posts have got, or comments and shares, are essentially right signals of how others are responding to us, right? But what happens when they are quantified? What happens when you're actually putting a number to it? And why is Facebook choosing some metrics more than others, right? So that's what the paper argues. So they say that things like number of posts, shares, likes about your actions, right? They essentially signal your self-worth, right? Your how others are perceiving you. And then this quantification is also making easy, right? So this is why quantification is becomes highly impactful, because it's making you compare your metrics with others. Yeah. So the moment you put a metric, then this comparison becomes easier, and that then creates a norm that you want more metrics, or you start comparing your metrics with metrics of other people, right? If somebody else is sharing a post, well, how many likes and shares are their post getting versus how many likes and shares are my post getting, right? So this quantification therefore is also, just like we saw nudges and that all of those in user interface design are important, right? Similarly, what metrics are we choosing to put up? These become important as well, because they can they can be used to enforce a particular social norm. And in this case, it's about your self-worth and esteem and how others value you, that it starts reinforcing. Yeah. And it's not just on Facebook, right? So they say that there are all these other things, right? That so many people claimed a particular offer, right? Right. And in fact, so there is a longish argument, right? That even things like even in the school system, so marks, IQ tests, right? Or what we call social sorting. So all of this is essentially making us conscious that okay, certain skills or certain capabilities are being measured, are measurable, and that makes us also compare, and that can be both good and bad, right? I mean, in some cases, like in the school system, you could say that maybe it will encourage students to do better. And I'm sure this must have been studied by psychologists that, and we see some of it also, right? That in the junior classes, typically this comparison is not done. So in my daughter's school, for example, she's in class 3, and so far they don't have any ranking kind of a system in their school that who's first, who's second, but they're slowly bringing it in. So now if they have some class competition, then they choose, let's say, top 5. But even within the top 5, they're not really ranking, right? First, second, third, and so on. And marks and stuff is not done right now. So essentially, they're waiting for the kids to become more mature, to become more psychologically mature in terms of, because they don't want kids to lose their self-worth, right? If just too much of this metricization is brought in too early, then it can have some of these harmful effects, right? So the point is that this is sort of known, right? That these metrics do have all these norm shaping and psychological effects. And therefore it becomes important to think through, right? What norms are these metrics really supporting? Yeah. And in Facebook's case, which metrics were chosen? Yeah. Right. Here, for example, metrics like number of likes and so on, right? These are metrics that are trying to build in a norm to increase user participation. Yeah, and to both make you value your own posts and stuff that you're making with this yardstick, that how are other people responding to it. But other metrics, right? If they could have shown other metrics, maybe it could have had different effects, like the how much time have you spent on Facebook, right? So we know that there are all these studies which we'll also look at now on addiction to Facebook and such things, which right. So there's all these studies which have shown that some of these technologies are addictive. But if you start showing some metrics, that how much time have you already spent on Facebook, maybe it could make you less addicted. Maybe it could be like safeguard that okay, you already spent an hour on Facebook today. Well, now let me do something else, right? Or time when you checked your feed last, right? So if you're checking it again and again, right, then why not show these metrics to reduce addiction? Yeah. Similarly, we saw some of the algorithmic aspects which we'll again revisit, that these algorithms in the newsfeed are geared towards showing news and information which makes us spend more time, right? So sensational news or even fake news, because that diverts our attention, that catches our attention. But versus other algorithms, right, which can have a more responsible or some kind of a stronger basis to them, like showing diverse information, right? So so that's the critical part to think about, right? That metrics, therefore, depending on how they're designed, right, they also have certain effects when you quantify, and it then again becomes a choice, right? What metrics are we using for what purpose? Because that really, right, this choice will really dictate, right, where are we trying to push the users towards, right? Yeah, right. And so there's other things that are also right. So once you do put in these metrics, the metrics are also used by Facebook's algorithm. So it sort of sucks you in, that if you don't have if your posts are not liked enough, then your posts will not appear also very highly in your friends' news feeds. So there becomes a feedback effect, that any that you're driven, that if you want to be visible to your friends, then you need to be making posts which are very exciting, or you need to be bring in some reciprocity, that you if you like other people's posts, then they will also like back your posts, right? So it gets into all of this mess of these feedback loops, right, which come into the picture. Others can also observe your metrics, so you become conscious of that. Similarly, time is also metricated. Things like some things are right, like very recent things are measured at the time scale of seconds, that this thing happened just 26 seconds ago. And as time goes further and further back, it gets less precise, right? About an hour ago, 3 days ago. So timestamp becomes vaguer with age. And all of this is where then you can argue that the reason why you're showing time is because it creates this norm that you don't want to miss out on anything. There's a need to stay updated, and then it becomes vaguer and vaguer with age, which again, right, makes you feel that, well, you're probably missing out on something. Yeah. So therefore, right, that's the idea. So I'll just come back to this. These people also then built a plugin, right, a browser plugin, which basically removes these metrics, right, called the demetricator. So this is what their interface then looks like, right? That, okay, some people like this. You don't know how many, but some people like this. Or, okay, there are friends, and maybe there are some mutual friends also, but you're not really getting to see, right, which ones, how many mutual friends, and so on. And then they took feedback from the users about, right, what they think about this demetricator. So it reinforces many of the issues that seem to be of concern, right? That now it doesn't matter to me how many likes something has. My opinion is based on the post and its discussion, right? The inherent quality, right? It's not based on which one is getting more likes and less likes and so on. So you're right. So these metrics which were distracting us from understanding the actual relevance of the content. Well, now if you remove those metrics, it sort of comes back to it. Yeah, right, that these notifications become like meth. You can't just stop checking and rechecking, so it's also creating that addictive effect. But all that has changed when I downloaded the add-on. No more ridiculous liking stars, no more mounds of notifications or the number of comments on other statuses. I finally feel at ease. It takes that crucial element that makes Facebook addictive to myself and so many other people. Yeah, so you can see how, right, this very simple thing, right? And I mean, all of us would be thinking about like designing apps, and many of us in the industry, many students, right? We're thinking about startups and apps and everything all the time, right? But I mean, it's important to think about, right, what elements are we, what all do we want to metricize and how it impacts. Yeah. Then other ways in which, right? So we talked about altruism. If so, some people said that they like other people's posts just to make the person not feel too bad. That if they had very few likes and they would be feeling bad, so chalo, let's like this post. Let's be nice to them, right? But there's other ways also, other dynamics it creates, like reciprocal altruism. That if I like somebody's post, then they will like my post also, right? Then there's a converse view also, that those of us with good metrics want to show them, right? So, right. So there are variations of differences of viewpoints, right? But yeah, I mean the main point is that this is important, right? What metrics are chosen that can betray what objectives you're trying to really achieve out of them, and it has to be done more carefully. Yeah. Yeah. Any points? Any thoughts on that?
Another way maybe behavior influences the occurrence of Goodhart's law, wherein people just try to increase the metric inorganically. So like if followers are an indication of status or whatever, so they would just buy followers or create 20 fake accounts and then follow themselves or something like that.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, it creates a whole economy. Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the whole fake news. So this whole stuff about fake news also. So it was a bit new for me to find out that normally, because in the media, we've normally seen fake news as being put out for like political purposes, right? That you purposely want to manipulate people with seeing some viewpoint or believing in something. But actually, that's not the main thing, right? Fake news is a huge industry, and they do this not for any like political beliefs or to like kill a particular or downgrade a particular political opponent or anything. It's all being done just for economic reasons, because right, so you can buy followers and so on. That makes your metrics look good, and then so that goes into like creation of fake accounts, bot accounts, and so on. Then there's also clickbait and click fraud, that when people click on these fake news, right, there are ads which are also appearing on those pages, and those ads then bring you more money, right? So fake news is partly, of course, is driven by politics, but a big role is actually just economic, right? So again, right, I mean, I completely agree with your point that yeah, once these metrics are encouraged, then it can create a whole economy behind it as well, right? So there's that. So this is another quite an interesting website, Ledger of Harms, which essentially is a collection of lots of papers which have talked about harmful effects of some of these addictive platforms, right? So things like attention, that people, right, when they get notifications, they tend to view these notifications right there and then, and it can impact other tasks that they're doing, right? So I'm sure, right, all of us have seen this, right, that if you're doing something and in parallel, our phones are buzzing and ringing when there's new messages, WhatsApp messages and so on coming, right? It's very distractive. So it's all measured, instrumented, it's proven. Things like mental health issues, how well you sleep if you're checking some of these things, or how this peer pressure, social pressure gets created when you're seeing the performance of other people is made more visible. There's relationship issues which are caused when you're using only chat and text as a mode of interaction, as opposed to actually face to face or talking to them over the phone, right? So the kind of media channel you're using, that affects the quality of the interaction, and how well are you able to make out cues, or how well able to represent that. Then, of course, there's the influence on democracy, right? So, fake news. There's this very nice paper by Dave Roy and Aral from MIT, published some time back, that fake news travels 6 times faster. And this is again, right, regular human psychology, that okay, these things, these news appear more sensational, more interesting, so you click on those, and that creates this feedback effect, that these algorithms which are ranking the news, they start attaching greater value, and they start ranking this news higher than others, right? So it creates this feedback effect. We look at some of this effect with search engines also. The search engines can also shift voting preferences. Again, right, just completely based on the ranking. On YouTube, there's this radicalization that can happen when you get trapped into filter bubbles. So you start watching some videos and then you suddenly get more and more videos of the same thing, right? So these are problems with. So we look at many of these when we study algorithms, right? But yeah. So the point is that a lot of this is known, how technology impacts socialization among children. Now, many of these, many people who've done these technologies actually don't have their own children use it, right? Because they understand the addictive properties and everything, right? But so, like, in fact, I was talking about my daughter's school. So these are now just things that I've also started noticing, that the school also encourages them to search for like facts and stuff on Google. And something that made me quite uneasy just yesterday was they had to draw a food chain, right? So you know what a food chain is, right? Predator eats something, that person eats something else, that person eats something else. And so she wanted to make this food chain, but now she's figured out that okay, I can ask Papa to search for this on Google, and I'll just get a quick answer. So the first option that came up, so she wanted to understand something, that what do eagles eat, and she likes eagles. And so Google just gave a quick answer, and that was it. In fact, I spent more time just reading up a couple of other pages, right? That what else do eagles eat? What other way could be made, right? What's the dominant food chain? But none of that really concerned her, right? She just got the first option and she was just happy with it, right? So the point is that how these technologies are used by children, how it changes, right? To what depth are they really exploring some of these topics? That becomes important. And schools also need to be more aware that is it really encouraging like a quick gratification behavior among children, that okay, now we've gotten our answer, now let's move on, there's no need to understand anything more, versus had they actually tried to open up an encyclopedia and read about it, right? Which is a slightly more high friction user interface, but that it comes with benefits, because you get to learn a lot more about that subject, rather than just that one point answer, and which may even not be the best answer, the most precise answer. Yeah. So there are all of these effects, therefore, that become important when we're looking at technologies, right? Right. So the questions that this raises, therefore, is that when we're building a technology, then we've not really thought so much, right, about it, and we may not even have studied and experimented with all of these, right? So all of these studies are what are coming out after technologies have been adopted and are being used, right? So what should be a better way of designing technologies, designing platforms? right? So last week we saw that there are all of these different kinds of questions which are suggested that if you're thinking of a new technology, then you answer these sets of questions. So it's like a checklist based method which is presented, that if you answer these questions, it will make you probably think about what's happening and so on. But a lot of it is speculative, right? A lot of those questions you can't really answer because you've not really measured them. You've not really measured their effects. As opposed to in medical ethics, we saw that none of these technologies are actually released unless there's a detailed study that has been done, right, on their positive effects, negative effects, and then it gets released with the right regulations and checks and balances, right? So again, it's something to think about, right? That what could this process have looked like alternatively, right? Why is innovation so important, right? What drives innovation? Why do we value innovation so much, right? Versus going slow and trying to understand these effects before something is popularized or before something is scaled up, right? So again, there's no clear answer, but these are important questions, right? Because it's about, right, like some of the views that we saw, that medical ethics really keeps the patient, the beneficiary, at the center, right? And the question that they always try to answer is that, is this helping? Is the technology helping the person or not? Right? Those four things about autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice that medical ethics talks about, because they keep the patient at the center, right? Now, Flaherty, whom we also briefly spoke about, right? Flaherty says that people are information beings, and the information impacts us, right? Information impacts what we become, right? So if we were to keep that view, in that case, we would say that a framework like medical ethics is very important, because all of these technologies are really about what information are we receiving, and this information that we're receiving can shape us, and therefore you will think that is this shaping us for something good? Is this shaping us for something bad? Right? Is this so? Then you would probably, if you think of humans as informational organisms, info orgs, as Floridi calls us, then you would want a framework similar to medical ethics, right? Because you know that just like a patient is affected by the drugs or the medicine that you're given, humans are affected by the information that we receive. And therefore, it should be done in a more measured, rigorous manner, right? As opposed to just starting with using something and then letting regulation and other things catch up once studies happen on all of that, right? So it's a different view, right? That's the main point, that it's a different view of are we valuing innovation because of the economic growth and development possibilities that it allows, versus are we looking at ourselves as informational organisms which are getting affected by information, and therefore we should think and release all of these, do these innovations and technologies in a better way. Yeah. So again, right? So bottom line being that even the simple thing of the user interface, which is the first part that we started out with, how deep that is, right? That's the main point. Yeah. So let's get to, right. So this is now another aspect which is again very interesting, right? That how we also tend to perceive of computers as social actors, right? So here, right, so Fogg is one of the very prominent. So he's also a psychologist, right? So in fact, I mean, all these studies on user interfaces, right? That so mostly has been looked at by psychologists, and so he did a lot of experiments where, so for example, if a persona, like so we know that there are avatars and personas that, like, technology like chatbots, right, support. And now, of course, it's gone to another level. So just yesterday, again, I keep talking about my daughter now. So she discovered an ad where Amitabh Bachchan's voice is now on Alexa, right? So now you can think, right, that now Amitabh Bachchan is associated with like a authority figure with lots of various admirable qualities, right? Stuff that he's done in the movies and so on. And so Fogg basically saw that we actually start correlating some of these qualities with even things like intelligence and honesty, even though it may not have anything to do with that, even though, right, attractiveness may have nothing to do with intelligence and honesty. But these experiments that he did, he saw that, well, this is people do have this tendency to associate intelligence and honesty also with with some of this, right? So suggestions that Amitabh Bachchan might be making, right, even through technology, even through Alexa, we would tend to value those more than, let's say, suggestions being made by me, for example, right? I would not stand anywhere close to Amitabh Bachchan. Similarly, there's many other things that Fogg studied, right? So he designed this game that people took called the Desert Survivor Study. That essentially, the question is that if you're in a desert, then what tools would you carry with you? Would you carry a rope with you? Would you carry a torch with you? Would you carry a compass with you? And so on, right? And the computer is assisting you in the process, right? So here again, you notice that there's just simple things like if the computer is making suggestions in a bold and assertive font or a gentle font, that has an effect on how we perceive, right? A bold and assertive font, we tend to view it as more authoritative, more reliable, right? Or how the statement is made, right? You should take this versus I think this will help, right? The way the statements are made, right? That affects, right? Visible, where this is being shown visibly of how confident I am, right? I really think that you should do this, right? So even that simple addition that I really think I those sorts of things have an effect. Then there's assortativity, that if you are a dominant, if your personality is dominant, you tend to prefer a dominant personality also in what the computer is saying. Then things like so Fogg divided people into different teams. Some users were in a red team, some users were in a blue team. And then the color of the computer frame was similarly shuffled, that some users with the red team got a blue computer, some users in the red team got a red computer. And the same team was another effect that was quite visible, right? That people said that seems to be friendlier, smarter, even though it was giving the same kind of information. So technically there was no difference, but this is just a perception that therefore came up. Yeah. So now the point is that this is right. So why Fogg says that computers are perceived as social actors, right? Because these biases are what we anyway have, right? If somebody were to make authoritative statements, we do tend to view those as more, right, confident. Very few of us would think critically to question that, right? I mean, this is the whole part where oration, rhetoric, right, these sorts of things become more important than reason, and this is what like politicians do all the time, or people who are great orators, they do all the time, right? So there's nothing new in this, but the point is that even when it's not a person doing it, right, it's a computer doing it, even then we tend to view the computer as a social actor. Yeah, that's the part that Fogg essentially brought out, right, which is quite relevant, right, which is essentially saying that the more we make a computer act like a human, people do have a tendency to view the computer as a social, as a human being, and that therefore can, and because, right, just like the nudge and behavioral economics angles, right, all of these things are known. So again, it becomes a scope for manipulation. Yeah. So we also looked at it briefly, looked at it in Weizenbaum's criticism of psychotherapy, right, where that computers should not be used for psychotherapy because it makes humans give more agency to computers as opposed to keeping a belief in humans itself, right? So these things are therefore quite relevant. So there's all sorts of other things like reciprocity that Fogg noticed, right? That in one case the computer helps the human, so it's like a cooperative. The computer is being cooperative, and if the user is also cooperative, then it improves the performance. So if you put a cooperative computer and a cooperative human together, the overall performance is much better as opposed to like a uncooperative computer. So there are all of these things about other things that where the computer appears as cooperative, as a friend, or the computer appears as an opponent or as an assistant, right? So these are the kind of personalities essentially that you can actually embed in the technology, and each of these personalities will have a different effect, right? So cooperative personality may overall improve the performance, but do you want to do that, right? Or as opposed to like a friendly personality or an opponent who is constantly urging you to do better and better, right? So these are different personalities which have different effects, and you can embed personality into machines, and humans, we tend to see computers as social actors, and therefore we will be influenced by this personality that has been coded into it. So similarly, other things, happiness, anger, fear, and so on. Yeah. And of course, right, this of course then raises all these ethical concerns that psychological cues can mislead users about what is the true nature of the machine, right? And that is where it can be used as a manipulative tool, right? So if you know how a particular person responds to a particular technology, which is also right, that like dominant users respond to dominant personalities, dominant computers with dominant personalities, right? So all of these things can be used to make us do things that we may not do, or which may not even be the best for us, right? So these things become important. Yeah. One view also is interesting, that it's actually impossible to answer this question, that should we ask a question that should personality be embedded in computers or not. So the view says that, well, computers will always have a personality. People will always view computers as social actors, and therefore you take the argument one level further, that therefore it becomes important to pay attention to the personality that has been encoded in the machine, right? And again, right, just like the ledger of harms, to make sure that this personality is not causing us to do things which are not useful for us or not good for us. Yeah. So these things are important. So Fogg also came up with this behavioral model, which again, I mean, it's quite simple, but just interesting to think about. So he said that there are these, so there are, right, so if we want to persuade users to adopt a particular behavior, it's mostly, right, users will adopt a particular behavior if the motivation and the ability align with each other. Motivation meaning that, is this target behavior giving us pleasure or pain or hope of acceptance or rejection? And ability meaning that, do we have the time to do this? Do we have the money to adopt the behavior? Is it easy for us? Can we cognitively cope with it? Does it comply with social norms? Is it routine? Is it non-routine, like a habit, right? So what Fogg basically said, that how do we trigger? Can we make sure that this target behavior gets adopted more and more, right? So how do we make sure that these core motivators and some of these simplicity factors that improve the ability to adopt the behavior, how do they become easier? How can we bring them together? So he said that there are typically three such triggers. Yeah, that there should be a spark to leverage any of the three motivators. So a trigger which is being shown, it should clearly help the person understand whether they will be better off, right? Whether there will be pleasure or more, or hope, or greater acceptance. So something, right, just to put that spark, that okay, I'm going to benefit. And similarly, facilitator, that a trigger which makes one of these things easier to do. Yeah. Or just a signal as a reminder that if you do this, then there'll be these motivations that you will gain, and you already have the time or money and so on to adopt that particular behavior, right? So he said that there are these three triggers, therefore, and people should notice the trigger. People should associate this trigger with the target behavior, and so these triggers can then persuade users to adopt the behavior. Yeah. So it's just a way of thinking, right? But the point is that, just like the nudge theory, where you're measuring and you're proposing that, okay, these nudges, or these nudges can be implemented in this way. In the same way, here Fogg is also providing us with a framework that to trigger a particular behavior among users, we need to think about what are their people's motivations, what are factors influencing their ability, and then we need to remind them, we need to facilitate them, we need to similarly remind them of which of these three motivators. So if some of these things happen, then they will adopt this target behavior. Yeah. So again, this becomes relevant when we think about, right, how technology can persuade people to adopt behaviors, right? So again, the broad point is that technology can therefore, the user interfaces especially that we're working with, they can persuade us to adopt certain behaviors if we design these triggers properly. right? So triggers in this case, in the case of technology, could be like pop-ups which show up or reminders which show up every now and then, right? So if these things are designed in a way to spark or facilitate or signal, then it will lead to a greater inclination of users to adopt that behavior. And then you think about the ethics of this, whether it's actually useful for the user or it can actually be also used to manipulate. Yeah. Right. So similarly, right, you can think of it from different ethical theories, right? That right. So Rawls would say that creators of a persuasive technology should never seek to persuade users of something they themselves would not consent to be persuaded to do. Right. So this is when you think through a veil of ignorance. You put yourself in the shoes of unspecified users, and then would you as a technology designer, would you have wanted to be influenced in this way or not? Yeah. So Kant would, of course, right, so would completely reject some of this, that should not misinform in order to achieve their own end, which is about using others as a means to your goals, right? We should disclose motivations, methods, and the intended outcome. So this is, again, right, coming from Kant about viewing everybody as rational beings. Then there's consequentialism, that to think about what are the outcomes, what kind of risks can arise if this behavior was adopted, or some of this information was manipulated when used by other people, right? So you can think of it from that point of view, right? And just more broadly also, that would the intended outcome, right, with or without technology, right, would the intended outcome be deemed ethical at all, right? So again, looking at it from a more consequential outcome based point of view, that if a particular outcome is not ethical, then bringing technology will not make it ethical, right? It will remain unethical, right? So again, the point is that technology can create all these persuasive effects, yeah, and it can be misused. So that's where you can see how different theories would also talk about what rules or what guidelines should we be following when we think about this. Yeah. So interactive technologies can make it right. So like some of the options, things that we saw, right, experiments that Fogg had done, or some of the ones with nudge theory. So many of those examples were not interactive, but now you can imagine that the technology can, of course, be interactive also, right? It can keep sending reminders and so on, right? So that can amplify, that can make it even easier to create these persuasive effects. So therefore, it becomes even more important to think through many of these rules and be more thoughtful when we're building these interfaces. So yeah, so you can go through this, right? So again, looking at, right, is the outcome intended or unintended, right? If it is intended, then is it ethical or not ethical? If it is unintended, was it predictable, not predictable, right? So these are essentially, I mean, it's a simple framework, but these are things that people have tried to put together to help designers think through this, right? That what effects would their persuasive technologies have on others? Yeah. So any questions? There's just 2-3 more slides, so I'll just finish them. Then we can move to privacy, data and privacy next time. But any questions?
I don't have any questions, but I have a couple of examples which I would like to highlight while listening your lecture. So one example is Amazon fake selling. Like they do the fake selling of the products and show some of the products are highly sellable. Second is the notifications from Facebook and LinkedIn or Twitter trying to bring back the consumer or bring back the customers to their website and spend more time. Uh, Third thing is some of the uh, important disclosures are written in very small font, which nobody can read until unless they have some magnifying lens or something like that on the websites. Some other examples are like some of the important things are put several layers in behind the main screen. Like if you want to see certain things which are important to buy the products and all, they are not on the first page; they are on the last page or something like. Even you can find it with a very, I mean, clear intentions. So
Yeah.
those are the things which I thought of maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely correct. Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many such cases that we must have seen, right? And yeah, I completely agree with all of this. So it goes on to show ultimately, right, that once we know that okay, people will behave in a particular way if they're shown some particular information, then yeah, I mean, it raises all these ethical issues, right? That is it being who is benefiting, right, ultimately from showing all this. Cool. So maybe I'll just quickly share a couple of other points. So these are some other perspectives also, right? This is more to do with complexity of the design. So an example is that of the car radio, and I mean this is something I struggle with myself. So and it is the reason why I included this is because this is such an old paper which I came across from 2000, and now we're in 2021, and the same issues are still there. So it's very difficult to change the right. So if you want to find a radio station, then you have to press a button for. I mean, it's not just a click. So there's a short click, there's a long click, and they mean different things. Similarly, this paper says that I mean I never figured this out on my car radio, but apparently there are all these other things which you can write different things that you can manipulate to bring up more information about the song which is playing. So something called RDS, which accompanies FM radio. So there's like a small sliver of bandwidth which is dedicated to sending digital information. FM, as you know, is an analog broadcast medium, right? But along with the analog broadcast, there is a small sliver of spectrum which is used to send digital information, like the name of the song. So that's how you, when you're playing a radio station, you sometimes see the name of the song also being played. So it comes through RDS. And there's ways to get more information. So I never figured it out, but yeah, I mean there's like some weird combination of stuff. And the manual of a Kenwood radio in 1998 was 500 pages long. And now we have radio, email, navigation, so many different things. Yeah. So you can imagine how the safety when you're driving a car and you have to do this complicated stuff, it really can impact the safety. And maybe people must have done studies. I have not done that kind of a thorough literature search. But yeah, I mean things like complexity of the interface becomes important, right? So again, right? So this so if you think of it from Rawls, the Justice and Design Duquesnoy's paper that we mentioned in an earlier class, right? That the designer is really in a more powerful position than the user, right? So it's an unequal thing, and as per Rawls' theory of principles of justice, right? The point is that the designer should be really looking at leveraging this power inequality to actually see how it can benefit the user, right? Who's less well off than the designer in their knowledge of the technology, right? But it seems that's not how this thing is done, right? It's been like more than 20 years, but same kind of interface issues persist. Yeah, right. So the same authors also talk about Moore's law, right? And Moore's law, just because the performance is improving continuously, it seems that there's a tendency to add more and more features to leverage this performance, as opposed to actually improve the usability itself, right? So a very famous designer, Don Norman, who wrote this book, Design of Everyday Things, right? So he says that products get distinguished during earlier stages by the performance and later by their usability, right? But it seems that this shift doesn't happen all the time, right? So it's not that all the time you would first focus on performance and then you would start focusing on usability. The radio example actually shows that usability has not been considered at all. It's been more than 20 years, but the radio interface has not been made easier or more usable. Rather, the improved performance of electronics and computerization has just been used to add more and more features. So now that same radio, okay, there's a radio, now there's navigation also on it. Now you can also do phones through all of this. So it's just being used to add more and more features, but the usability did not really get impacted. Right. So this is also what they say, that Moore's law is basically about technology. It's not about impact. Right? How much more impactful? The question should be, how much more impactful does the technology become every 18 months? So we know that okay, it's becoming faster and so on every 18 months, but how usable, how impactful is it really becoming? Right? Because otherwise, this whole idea of improved performance and adding more and more features means that things are replaced and right, things are continuously replaced rather than being focused on improving their impact or usability. Yeah. So it's interesting to think of it in that way, right? So this showed that where some simple things like menu on an old Nokia phone, just redesigning the menu with no change on the technology, no change with on performance, right? But it improved the average time to complete a task from right. So some particular task which they measured, but from like 16.5 to 9.5 seconds. Right? So again, there's something for us to think about, that for different technologies, different interfaces that we might see, and if you think about how they have evolved, what has changed, right? Performance we know has improved, right? Computational performance has improved, but has the usability improved or not? Has our capability to control these technologies, these interfaces improved? Are we able to use them in a better way now, right? So what has changed? So this is an interesting way to think about this. Yeah. So we'll bring this up again a couple of times later, but essentially, right, the what we are seeing now with what we've discussed so far with the user interfaces is that ultimately there are certain values which we are embedding in the technology. Yeah. There are, right, so values like how much of freedom are we giving to the users, or how much are we persuading them to do certain things. And sometimes these values would be misrepresented also, right? When we're presenting, when you're pitching a product or marketing a product, sometimes we may just misrepresent. Katie Shilton and others, right? So they basically came up with this very simple framework saying that you should think at 3 levels when you're evaluating any system. So think in terms of salience, that extent to which a particular value that you think is important, or which a product seller is considering to be important, right? To what extent is that value central or peripheral to the technology system, right? So is it really built into, centrally built into the technology and how it's used, or not, right? Right. So is that claim really correct, that the value exists? Then what is the intention? Right, that is this value, was it purposely built into the technology system, which meant that the designer has actually thought about it, right? Or is it just coming accidentally? So something like moral luck, right? That is it just coming accidentally, or was there actual thought put into this? And then enactment, the extent to which a value has the potential to be exercised in the technology system, because sometimes it may be that the value is there, but it's just hidden, right? So this is an interesting 3 properties with which to think about when we try to analyze a particular system in terms of what values does it hold, right? So to check the claim, that does this value really exist? What was the intention, right? Was it really done with the intention to have that value, or is it just something like accidental observation that we're having? And is it really being enacted in practice? Yeah.